The perfume haunted me. It fluttered through the air, and it teased me, leading me towards an obscured end. I ran down the hallways, bathed in red tapestries, my nightgown shuddering in the cold. Moonlight showered me as the way that I searched for the perfume's source. Around blind corners and through doorways of solid oak, and into rooms once filled with laughter and terrible deeds. With each step, the scent grew stronger. Roses, a sting of ginger and citrus, never quite putting my finger on the familiarity of it all. And when I entered the chamber, the old room that differed from the rest, one solitary candle sat by a large four-poster bed. The light cascaded out, revealing a room dark and brooding. The floor was cold, and the wood warped slightly. My bare feet lost what little heat they once held. A huge fireplace lay opposite the bed, unlit and devoid of life. And above it, a large portrait dominated the room. In the painting, a woman sat, wearing a dark green dress of many decades past. Her hair was pulled tightly in a bun, and her pale skin like languid pearl, and her eyes cold and cruel with dispassion. Those eyes seemed to watch, following me as I wandered around the bed until I stood at its foot. A once rich, now faded crimson blanket covered the mattress, and as the candlelight struggled against my unseen draft, it became clear that someone lay in the bed. I could not see the face of this person. The body was covered from head to foot by the red blanket, shrouded by it. The sight of the cloth outline struck fear into my heart. I dared not remove the blanket, uncertain that my nerves could endure the shock. Again, I was stung by the familiarity of it all, a memory hiding in the shadows just out of sight, refusing to reveal itself. The pungent rose perfume was stronger than it had been before, as I could feel the spiteful gaze of the portrait behind me, watching the proceedings. Then I noticed another scent, something that had festered in the room for years, obscured by the sweetness of the perfume. A foul underbelly. As I stared at the outline of the head and the body beneath the blanket, the stench grew. And with each breath, I was treated to a mixture of roses and something humid, murky, like soil after a downpour. There was something rotten in the room with me, the rancid smell so thick that I could taste it. The hidden memory thickened to break loose from its chains. I had to flee. Run. Be away from the room, that house, out in the open where I could breathe again. I walked quickly to the door where I had entered, and it was locked. I twisted at the metal handle, its spherical body covered in dark brown paint. The locked mechanism entombed in the oak echoed into the distant recesses that taunted me and resisted. I was a prisoner confined to a solitary room, to a place where the sweet air of flowers was mixed with that of death. And I pounded at the door, shouted and screamed. But my pleas went unanswered. They simply faded into the lonely house, my family home, which I had not visited since I was 7, a place that hid dark recollections, the wounds that ran deep, covered thinly by the preceding decades. And last I gave in. I stopped my protests, rested my forehead on the cold wooden surface of the locked door, and tried to compose myself. And then I heard the sound. One at first, followed by 3 others. It was a clicking, creaking noise. I turned around slowly to see what was there, but the room was as it had been. The body in the bed lay still, the blanket forming a perfect impression of it. The bedside candle flickered but remained, and as it did, so shadows danced around the room. They created the illusion of movement. And for a moment I stared at the portrait, the woman's eyes peering at me from above the darkened fireplace. And was as if the flickering of recognition fell across the face. I shuddered, believing that it was merely a trick of the light. But still, the face looked on. And then I heard the creaking again, a series of quick clicks, like an aching door that had not been opened for an age, slowly moving into the night. But I could not see the source. My heart raced as I looked around, and for the first time I noticed the dim light, and there lay an old wooden wardrobe on the other side of the room. The creaking sounded once more. A frightful unease began to take over as each click sounded that both puzzled and repulsed me. I turned to the door and I twisted the handle as hard as I could, but the reality had not changed. I was locked in that room with a body rotting under the sheets and a clicking noise coming from inside the wardrobe. A noise that felt organic, alive somehow, differing itself from the shifting contractions of the wood floor and beams of the old house. It at once sounded natural and yet felt unnatural. Another creaking and clicking, and I knew that I had to look at the wardrobe across the room. I was terrified by what I might find, but the anticipation of waiting, just waiting until something threatening emerged from the wooden tomb, was too much to bear. I wanted this torturous night to be over, to return to my adult life. Something had compelled me to visit my ancestral home, but I was sure that if I felt the cold breeze of the outside world again, I would curse that place and never return. Obscured memories flickered in front of my eyes once more, the familiarity of the perfume stinging my senses. The room, a dreadful window into my past. I could not be tortured like this, played with. I had to know what was inside that wardrobe. And I stepped forward, moving around and then to the foot of the bed. I was certain that the portrait stared on menacingly, but I dared not catch its eye, and so my gaze remained fixed on the wardrobe as I neared. The clicking and creaking noise sounded intermittently. With each step I listened intently, something being greeted by the horrid sound. Other times being welcomed by the silence, an equally unappalling nightmare noise. As I reached my hand out to the wardrobe door, my blood ran cold. The door moved, ever so slightly. But it did move. I could see an inch of the darkness inside, a small sliver of black air, and I felt as though a watchful eye was glaring at me from within it. A creak reapplied to my proximity, this time louder than before. It took on a new characteristic, like knuckles being clicked, bone and ligament snapping in place. Limbs that had not moved for an age breaking free of time's relentless hold. I reached my hand out slowly and pulled the door open with force. And for a moment, I thought as though I saw two eyes in the dark of the wardrobe peering at me. But as the light from the room's solitary candle reached the dark place, I saw nothing. No clothes, no belongings, no creeping eyes, just the emptiness of life now vacant. And I sighed with relief. But when I turned to the room, I froze. Something was different. Something had changed. It wasn't the portrait on the wall. The bitter face of the woman in the painting stared onward. It wasn't the fireplace either, remaining as it did, unlit, its mouth bathed in night. It wasn't the door on the other side of the room, my only avenue for escape, standing closed, no doubt locked by some unseen jailer. No, none of these things had changed. But what had frightened me, tore at any composure I still had within me, was the figure lying under the covers in the bed. That dead, silent corpse that filled the air with perfume and macabre aura. It was gone. The red blanket had been pulled aside, revealing white silk sheets. And the only evidence that someone had been lying there was an impression in the mattress, an outline of a now missing body. I gasped as the creaking sounded once more, this time from the bed. But there was no sign of the body. The room was unoccupied, and yet the air did not feel absent of company. Something was there. I looked around, and it was then that I entertained the thought, one otherwise which had been preposterous to me. Perhaps it was an invisible specter that had been lying under the red blanket. An apparition with the body of a person, but transparent to the naked eye. Creaking noise. And that noise drew closer. Another creak. This time from the foot of the bed. Whatever it was slowly walking towards me. The warped floorboards shifting under its weight, the only sign that I wasn't alone. If only I could see the cadaverous thing before it placed its rotten hands on me. And with that thought, I leapt on the bed. And as the specter stepped forward, I pulled the sheets off the mattress, throwing them into the air like a net. They fluttered with movement, bringing them with then sweet, rancid perfume. And then they came to rest. But not on the floor. Instead, they covered the walking corpse, showing me its outline. A shrouded dress of white sheets resting over something hideous beneath. Perhaps I could have allowed the thing to walk unseen. For the sight of the long draped sheet stepped towards me, almost stopping my heart. Each invisible footstep brought me within pangs of dread, the likes of which I had never experienced before. And then came the rustling, as something else moved underneath the sheets, a prodding motion. As what I could only assume were two hands outstretched beneath their shroud reached out towards me. I stumbled backwards and I cried out, and as I did the room dimmed. My retreat had led me into the wardrobe. The arms of the shrouded figure were now almost upon me, and the only recourse was to pull the wooden doors of the wardrobe towards me, to shelter me from this thing. My newfound sanctuary shook violently as the shrouded specter heaved and pulled at the door. I held on with my every might, my fingers poking out into the room, grasping onto the piece of the wood, the only barrier between me and the rotted apparition. Memories began to flood back. The dark wardrobe had triggered to painful events that I had managed to bury deep within me. Of a little girl locked in a dark place. Cellars, attics, and wardrobes. A girl put upon, beaten, and mocked, emotionally tortured by her one and only caregiver. My body convulsed and shivered as the reality of my early childhood had filtered through. The attack ceased, and silence became my world. And that's when I heard two whispers. Little Sophie. The words were more breath than voice, and in them I recognized the speaker. My grandmother, that horrid woman who had abused her duty. I was an only child, I screamed at the top of my lungs. How could you? And still I held on tightly to the door, sure that the spirit of my grandmother stood in front of it. This was confirmed to me when I felt a warm, sticky breath on my fingers. A mouth, seen or unseen, must have hovered over them for a moment, exhaling foul air. Then something wet licked the length of my fingers, a rotten tongue from beyond. But I dared not open the door, because there was little that I could do. I held on to it tightly while the ghost of my twisted grandmother licked at my exposed flesh. And then nothing. Again, silence. No breath. No shaking of the doors. Nothing. Teeth dripped with saliva, then bit hard down onto my fingers. I screamed in agony as they delved deep through my skin and then crunched onto bone. Under my screams of pain, I heard a laugh of delight. History had repeated itself as more memories flooded through the torture. She had done awful things in the past. Malevolent, twisted things. Locking me in the darkness, beating, prodding, and more. The pain of memory mixed with the pain of moment of those dreaded teeth that ground deeper. No more. I screamed and I raged and I pushed the wardrobe door, knocking the shrouded figure to the ground. My fingers gushed blood, but they were free, just as I was. I leaped onto the bed and I charged for the locked door once more. I yelled and I cried and I fought as the door remained tightly closed. It would not budge. I pounded and I railed against my imprisonment. The two hands reached from behind, wrapping sheet-covered fingers around my neck. And we struggled. The grip around my throat tightened, choking the breath from me. And in a moment's rage, a moment of pure survival, I reached for the solitary candle that sat by the bed and cast it to the feet of my grandmother, catching the shroud of the sheets. And the room burned. The bed, painting, the wardrobe. And my last memory was looking beside me to see my grandmother's corpse burning on the ground. I was found standing in the garden of my family home, dazed, watching it collapse in and on itself, consumed by flames. I had returned to my childhood home to oversee my grandmother's things after she was done with this mortal world. But it appeared that she was not done with me. And after this night, at long last, I was certainly done with her. No one should have to walk in on a suicide, especially not a teenage kid. Dad had always warned me about depression. Depression is a demon, he would say. And looking back, I could see why it was that he wanted to grind that topic into my head so often. When I was younger, I was absorbed into my life. That is what teenagers do, after all. Teenage problems, teenage drama, teenage angst. You miss some of the larger issues that are right in front of you. I missed that Dad had switched jobs, not for better money or for something that he liked better, but because he was let go. I didn't understand the yelling that happened into the late night that I would drown out with music. I overlooked the nights that I came home after curfew and Dad was always waiting up to make sure that I was okay. Dad would say that depression would loom around. It would hang on your shoulders. And even when you think it's gone, it'll be there, waiting for that low point. I don't think that I noticed what he was trying to tell me. I remember we would go on family trips, and Dad would always smile when he looked off and into the distance, almost like he wasn't really there. He was thinking about something else that only he knew about. I think Mom noticed it too. It tore into her so much to the point that she moved out. She said that she couldn't handle him anymore. And when I found the note, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know that the word goodbye could be as powerful as it was on the yellow notepad. And I ran through the house screaming for him. Dad? Dad! My feet thumped around the first floor and up the stairs towards his bedroom. A thin line of light showed under the bathroom door. I pounded on it, yelling for him. Dad! All I could hear was my dad sobbing coming from the other side. Dad, please! I said more to myself than I did to him, unsure if I could even hear him with such a whisper. The doorknob was cold to the touch. My hand wrapped around it, but I couldn't will myself to turn it. I knew what that note meant. Dad was behind that door, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to see him as he might be. Had he already gone through with it? What should I do if he had? Should I wait to just call 911? But if I didn't go in now, would he go through with it before anyone else could be here to help me? Thoughts raced through me. But finally instinct took over. My body moved before my mind could find a conclusion. The door swung open slowly. And there he was. Razor to wrist and sitting on the bathtub. A small trickle of blood ran over his arm. He was shaking. The blade had just barely pierced his skin. He hadn't gone through with it yet. I could still help him. I didn't know what to say. Dad, please. Don't, please. It was all I could think of. But he didn't listen. He stared like he always did, away at something like he wasn't there with me. I followed his line of sight, and out of the corner of my eye, I could see it. Or I couldn't see it until I really wanted to. The shadow figure. An outlined figure of a man with no form. The form knelt before Dad. He was touching him. No, he was holding him. Holding his arms. Holding his hands. Dad wasn't cutting his wrists. The shadow, the thing that I could see, but couldn't see, it was cutting him. The long, smoky fingers of the thing held the razor over Dad's wrists. Its head would shift from the blade to meet Dad's gaze and then back again. It played with him, almost asking, should I? When I could finally break my eyes away, they locked with my father's. He stopped looking at the shadow. He was looking at me. Right into my eyes. Help me. The blade slid effortlessly down his arm, and Dad's eyes were watering as I froze. I had no idea what I was walking in on or what I was witnessing. Worst of all, I had no idea how to help. And Dad went limp. The shadow turned its head to me. His funeral was a few days ago. I haven't really left my room much since then. Mom calls me down for dinner and I try. I really do. But I don't think that I could ever tell her about the shadow that I saw with Dad. I don't think that I can ever tell her that it hasn't left my side since that day.
With reports that life may now be imitating art, VCR horrors.
Horror movies, mutilation, decapitation, torture. Does that sound entertaining?
America did not collapse. It crumbled. Nor did it crumble quickly. The crumbling occurred so slowly that no date could be attributed to the beginning of the end, nor to the ending itself. It happened over decades and generations. The nation slowly fell alongside the pages of the calendar, the leaves from the trees. It was a process as natural as the passing of time. One flag was lowered. One office building was locked, never to open again. One organization was shut down. One election was postponed and never rescheduled. One courthouse was boarded up. One prison was overrun. And then another, and then another, until every flag had been lowered. Every office had been locked. Every organization had been shut down. Every election had been indefinitely postponed. Every courthouse had been boarded up, and every inmate had escaped. And Francis Smith, the future heir of the Smith Empire, watched this crumbling occur through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his New York penthouse, located on the 67th floor, which provided him with an unobstructed panoramic view of Central Park. It had been his favorite view as a kid. He loved to press his nose against the glass and stare at the people below. The park was always so alive. Some came to exercise, while others came to relax to the warm sun. Some came to talk with friends, and some others came to get away. But by the time that Francis and his wife Eleanor had their 3 kids and inherited the penthouse, along with the rest of the Smith Empire, Central Park had become a symbol of America's decay. Every inch of the once beautiful park was covered with tents and wooden huts and broken down trucks with rusty trailers and the men and women who called these decrepit things homes. Every tree had been cut down. Every statue had been covered in graffiti. The lakes had been turned into bathhouses. The museum had been overturned with squatters. The paintings had been burned for warmth, and the statues within had been toppled and repurposed for shelter. As the years came and went, the number of tents and people in the park continued to grow, as did the difficulties that Francis had convincing his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren that Central Park really had been the most beautiful park in the world when he was a kid. "You should have seen it. There were baseball games and friends. They would throw frisbees and people would read books and runners go every which way and children making angels in the snow and..." But they did not believe him. "No way," they said to him. "That's impossible," they declared. "You're making all that up," they accused. And who could blame them for thinking that? The only Central Park that they had ever known was filled with endless violence that gave off a stench so strong that it reached their noses 67 floors above the ground, through incredibly thick glass. How could it have ever been a beautiful place? What was this crazy old man talking about? "You'll see," Francis told them. "One day the park will be returned to its old glory. I know it. And then you'll know Central Park as I knew it." But not even he believed this. He knew Central Park was never going to be the same again. And it made him sick. After all, his ancestors had worked incredibly hard to purchase the penthouse on the 67th floor, and they had paid an exorbitant amount of money for it. One of the major reasons they were willing to spend so much of their hard-earned money to buy the penthouse was because of the beautiful view it provided of Central Park. And yet, in just a few short decades, the park, the view, and the value of the property itself had been entirely ruined. Yes. Oh, yes. It made Francis sick. But it wasn't only Central Park that had been ruined by the increasing number of New York City vagrants and rejects. And it wasn't only the value of his penthouse that had been lowered. It was every other aspect of the city, and every business in it, including the ones that had been handed down to Francis by his ancestors, from his factories to his investment groups, from his media companies to his prisons, from his hospitals to his construction companies, from his farms and his corporations, the entirety of the Smith Empire. It was an epidemic that the city was unable to get under control, nor the rest of the nation. These people overflowed into the streets, down alleyways, across bridges, and into every borough of New York City. Everywhere Francis went, he was bombarded by beggars. "Please, sir, please, do you have any food? Are you hiring, sir? I'm willing to do anything." "My son, sir, he needs some new shoes. Do you happen to have $1 that you could spare?" Their tents were everywhere, entirely unavoidable, along with the violence that accompanied the culture of the impure and the impoverished. Broken glass from smashed-up windows sprayed across the sidewalks and glimmered beneath the ever-dimming streetlights overhead, as did these good-for-nothings that stole what they were incapable of earning on their own. And many times, as a result of walking through these dangerous streets, Francis's shoes would get nicked or scratched, and he would have to throw them away and replace them with new shoes fresh off the assembly line at his nearest factory. "What are you looking at?" he'd say to a worker who happened to be nearby. "I'm not paying you to stand around, am I?" "No, sir." "Then get back to work." "Yes, sir. I'm on it, sir." There was a constant state of fear in the workers' eyes. The fear that, if Francis was to let them go, they would have no choice but to become one of the derelicts in the city. Francis saw this fear. He could smell it, and he used it to drain every ounce of productivity from them. Many days he would just prowl the floors, the boardrooms, the cubicles, the hallways, letting his presence convey threats that needed not be uttered. After all, Francis had an empire that he needed to keep the power over. It was his family name that stamped all of New York City skyline. It was his name that signed at the bottom of their weekly checks. It was his family that he fed with the money that his companies made. And as he grew older, his family tree added new branches. He had to ensure that he had something great, something powerful to hand down to the next generation. He was the caregiver of the Smith estate, like his father before him, and his father before him, and his father before him. As the number of tents in Central Park grew exponentially, so too did the violence, the unrest, and the dangers of the city Francis had grown in, the city that he once loved. And before he knew it, the dangers had reached the doorstep of his empire. As the caregiver, he was faced with the difficult decision to remove his family and his empire from New York City. He gathered his 3 kids and 11 grandkids and over 24 great-grandkids and the scores of in-laws and cousins and nephews and nieces that he had accumulated over the years and ordered them to pack all of their things. "Don't ask questions," he said. "Just pack." The decision forced upon him made him distraught. He mourned the city that he had grown up in. He mourned the park that he had spent his entire childhood adoring. He mourned the life that had been stripped away from him by the good-for-nothings outside his window. But as the caregiver of the Smith Empire, he had to prevent it from falling like every other great empire before it. Like the American Empire was doing before his eyes, crumbling to dust. And so, with a caravan that extended nearly a mile, the Smith family left New York City, and they did not travel alone. Francis knew, for an empire to survive, workers were needed. So before he shut the doors to each of his businesses, he recruited his top employees, the ones that he knew were able to contribute to his new society: construction workers and architects, doctors and nurses, chefs and bakers, security guards and artists. And they were glad to come. Glad to escape the crime of New York City, glad to still have a job of any kind, glad to not be thrown out onto the streets like the thousands of former co-workers Francis had to fire. Their caravan was made up of car carriers, moving vans, Bulldozers, forklifts, tractors, lumber trucks, livestock trailers, refrigerated trucks, tanker trucks, digger derricks, container lorries, and everything else needed for the Smith family to create a whole new world. Guns peeked out the windows to deter thieves from approaching the caravan, though there were still thieves desperate enough to sacrifice everything, even their lives. As a result, many times these guns were shot, reloaded, and shot again. The dead thieves were put to good use by their fellow peasants. Their pockets were picked, their clothes stripped, their limbs torn to pieces, their skin burned to a crisp, their bones carved into weapons, and their meat quickly digested by the savages who had recently considered them friends and family. The workers saw this occur from the comfort of their vehicles provided to them by Francis, and thanked the nearest smith for saving them from such a harsh reality. "Thank you, miss," they said. "Thank you, sir," they said. "Without your kindness, we would be just like them," they said. "We owe you our lives." The caravan traveled nearly 200 miles northwest to a large property that had been in the Smith Empire for over a century. The land was nothing more than crops and dirt for miles. But over a period of several months, the workers constructed for the Smith family a brand new manor. They built enough homes on the land for every Smith family, then quite a few more for future generations to come. They scattered between the homes a few tennis courts, 2 golf courses, a couple of basketball courts, a baseball diamond, a museum accumulated over the many generations, a library filled with tens of thousands of books once considered to be the rarest in the world, though now all books had become quite rare in America, as many bookstores and libraries had been burned in the pursuit of warmth, along with many other luxuries. They dug numerous wells and ensured water was safely delivered to every home. They created sophisticated systems of sanitation and plumbing. They built a stable for the horses and a pond for the soon-to-be sashimi. They left behind several acres of crops and planted gardens and anything else the Smith family needed to sustain life and, more importantly, enjoy the fruits of their ancestry. As for the workers, Francis allowed them to remain on the property, though not within the walls that they had built to protect the hard-earned sovereignty and the possessions of his inheritance. Instead, he graciously allowed them to build a settlement just beyond the manor walls. He kindly provided them, for just a few extra hours of work, all the leftovers from his travels and constructs. He gave them plenty of wood, shipping containers, vans, tarpaulin, rope, and everything else that he himself could not put to use, or even half decent. With this material, the workers built themselves a settlement that somewhat resembled the lives of those who dwelled at the Central Park. Except this settlement was far from the violent lives that they would have been forced to live there. And for this, they were grateful. During the day, the settlers worked at the Smith Manor. They tended to the crops, cooked the food, cared for the children, cleaned the houses, entertained the Smith family with music and theater and art. In short, served them in every way that they were asked. At the end of each day, a dumpster filled with leftover food was rolled out onto the settlement for them and their families to graze upon. Occasionally, the dumpster was joined by a barrel of clean water. Although the outside settlement had none of the luxuries that existed within the manor, the settlers were nevertheless exceedingly grateful for everything that they were given. After all, they knew that they had not earned any of it, and that without the kindness of the Smiths, who were so willingly sharing with them the accumulations of their generational efforts, they would have been left to fend for themselves like every other out-of-work vagrant in New York, left to thieving for clothes and killing for crumbs. But fortunately for the settlers, they had crossed the path of one of America's most generous men, Francis Smith. And for reasons they could not quite explain, Francis had chosen to save them, while thousands of old workers were kicked onto the streets of New York City. So in honor of their savior, they named their settlement Francisville, and with the materials they accumulated over the new few years, they built near the entrance of the settlement a statue in his likeness. But still, This felt to the settlers like an insufficient way of thanking Francis for all that he had done for them, and all that he had saved them from. Then one day, as the settler was cleaning Francis's home, he overheard Francis telling his great-grandchildren about Central Park. "I would stay there for hours and watch the runners, the players, the readers, the sunbathers, and it was the most beautiful place on earth. But it is gone. It was stolen from our family. Your great-great-great-grandparents had earned us that view. And those peasants, they took it away." As the workers separated the food from the other bits of garbage in the trash before transporting it to the dumpster, he came up with an idea. And later that night, he and his fellow settlers dug through the dumpster for their daily meal. He shared the idea with all of Francisville. "Mr. Smith," he said as he picked the little bits of leftover chicken from the bone, "he loved Central Park as a kid. We can build him a new one just outside of his home. Then he can stand in his window and look out at it like he did when he was a kid." They spent the rest of the night creating a blueprint of Central Park entirely from memory. No, the lake was there. There was 6 softball fields, not 5. Don't forget the statue of the dog. Oh man, what was his name? Ball something, Balto? Yes, Balto. They adjusted the location of the statues a few inches this way, a couple of feet that way. They argued over the size of the lake, the slopes of hills, the curvature of walkways. Once they finally agreed upon the location of every aspect of the park, they calculated the different ways to adjust the park's scale to fit the land in front of Francis Smith's home. The following day, they began construction, trying to keep certain aspects secret. For instance, they covered the statues in tarpaulin. They did not form the softball fields until the project was nearly complete. The ponds were surrounded by wood fences to prevent visibility, and any time that they were asked what they were working on by a member of the Smith family, they would say that it was top secret, ordered not to be revealed until it was ready. It took them many months to complete the project, and when it was done, all of the settlers of Francisville gathered in front of Francis's home, along with the entire Smith family. One of the settlers went to the door and knocked, and when Francis answered, they said, "Sir, we have something that we would like to show you." Francis, with the aid of his cane and a couple of servants, walked slowly outside. "Move," he said to one of the settlers who blocked his way. "Out of my way," he said. And then he cleared the group and finally saw the park in front of him, and a smile came across his face. "Central Park," he whispered in his weakened and hoarse voice. "It's just like I remember," he said. Kids, look, it's just how I described." Francis went inside his home, and a few minutes later, he could be seen from the window of his 3rd floor, looking out at the park. He remembered everything. Every afternoon that he spent with his nose against the glass. He remembered the walkers and the joggers, the ball players and the frisbee throwers, the socialites and the isolationists, the sunbathers and the snow angel makers. And then he saw in his mind's eye the park, Central Park, and the one in his manor, being overrun by tenants and violent beggars. He saw the walkers and the joggers turned to sprinters who could not get away. He saw the ball players and frisbee throwers lose their smile as their game turned deadly. He saw the socialites spit and the isolationists looking for anyone to help. He saw the sunbathers covered in the shadows of invaders and the snow angels melting away. He looked down and he saw the settlers smiling up at him, waving, and he felt sick.